On June 7th, 1195, the English monk Gervase of Canterbury noted a remarkable event. "A marvelous sign has descended near London," he wrote, and went on to describe a dark cloud, which emitted a white substance which formed into a great ball beneath the cloud before descending in a fiery ball towards the river. And as fantastic as that all sounds, scientists today think he was talking about a real natural phenomenon called ball lightning, which is still not well understood today. And if he was the first person in history to reference that phenomenon. And like ball lightning, the date June 7th has illuminated so many events in history that deserve to be remembered. Great political changes have occurred on June 7th. One of the most consequential treaties in history was created on June 7th, 1494, when Portuguese and Spanish officials agreed on the Treaty of Tordesillas. The treaty, in response to lands discovered by Christopher Columbus, divided the newly discovered lands along a meridian set 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, giving Spain and Portugal exclusive rights of colonization and exploration. When King Francis I of France heard the news, he answered, "The sun shines for me as it does for others. I would very much like to see the clause of Adam's will, by which I should be denied my share of the world." In 1520, King Francis met with English King Henry VIII in the Pale of Calais, the last remaining English possession in France, beginning on the 7th of June at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. The meeting was meant to reaffirm friendship between the two countries, but also served as a spectacle meant to advertise the power of each kingdom. Elaborate armor, tents, and monkeys covered in gold leaf highlighted the event that was the subject of another episode of The History Guy. On June 7th, 1712, the Pennsylvania Assembly passed a law that banned importing new slaves to the colony. The act was actually part of a long history of the Pennsylvania Assembly, dominated by Quakers, passing anti-slavery acts, although it was also partially in reaction to the risk of slave rebellions, such as the one that had occurred in New York only a few months earlier. The 1712 Act effectively banned the slave trade by establishing a prohibitive duty, but it was overruled by forces in England. The act represents one of the earliest explicit anti-slavery acts by a government within the British Empire. June 7th saw other significant political changes for the United Kingdom as well. In 1628, the Petition of Right was passed in the English Parliament. Charles I was in the midst of the 30-Year War, but Parliament refused to provide funds for the war unless Charles I's favorite military commander, the Duke of Buckingham, was impeached for corruption. Instead, Charles imposed forced loans on his subjects and arrested them if they refused to lend him money. In 1628, he forced his subjects to accommodate and feed his soldiers. The House of Commons created 4 resolutions in response to protect individuals from the state. They barred taxation without the consent of Parliament, imprisonment without cause, the forced quartering of soldiers, and the use of martial law in peacetime. On June 7th, Charles was forced to give his assent. The Petition of Right is considered as important as the Magna Carta and the 1689 Bill of Rights, and had significant influence on future law, such as the American Constitution and its amendments. And it is fitting, then, that on June 7th, 1775, Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution to the Second Continental Congress that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Included in his resolution was a Declaration of Independence, a call to form alliance with foreign countries, and a plan for confederation. The Congress put together 3 committees to work on the resolution's 3 parts, but approval was delayed while members sought instructions from their respective colonies. On July 2nd, voting was held, and the resolution to sever ties with Great Britain was adopted. June 7th has also been an important date for the history of the expansion of the American frontier. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, the British Crown had barred any westward migration, as it lacked the manpower to effectively protect anything further westward. Many, however, flatly ignored the order. On June 7th, 1769, Daniel Boone first set sight on the land that would become Kentucky. Not a breeze shook the most tremulous leaf. I had gained the summit of a commanding ridge and looked around with astonishing delight. Beheld the ample plains, the beauteous tracts below, Boone wrote. In the 19th century, the Kentucky Historical Society established June 7th as Boone Day, with the National Day calendar suggesting that you explore the history books, museums, and historical sites in the places he lived. And while you do, you might enjoy some chocolate ice cream, because June 7th also happens to be National Chocolate Ice Cream Day. This date also marks numerous important dates in military history. On June 7th, 1099, European forces of the First Crusade began the siege of Jerusalem, Within a month, the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem from the Fatimid Caliphate in the first major battle of the Crusade. In 1639, a revolt in Catalonia was developing in response to Spanish policies, namely the presence of the Royal Army, largely made up of foreign mercenaries fighting against France as part of the 30 Years' War, and economic and military policies from the monarchy. On June 7, 1640, Corpus Christi Day, the Corpus de Sang, or Bloody Corpus riots occurred near Barcelona, led by peasants called reapers due to their work on farms. The riot sparked a general revolt in Catalonia, dubbed the Reapers' War. Catalan rebels soon allied with the French. The war outlasted the 30 Years' War, and only ended in 1659. Spain won the war, but lost all of Catalonia north of the Pyrenees, which was ceded to France. During the American Civil War, the first American citizen hanged for treason was hanged in New Orleans on June 7, 1862. On April 25th, ships under Admiral David Farragut anchored near New Orleans after having forced their way past Confederate defenses. Confederate defenders, seeing the futility of defending the city, were sent north. American Marines took down the Confederate flags at the New Orleans Mint and raised American ones. A mob gathered, and 7 people, including a man named William Mumford, removed the flag. Mumford took the flag to the mayor, although onlookers tore pieces of the flag off as he did so. 3 days later, General Benjamin Butler heard about the incident and had Mumford seized and charged him with high crimes and misdemeanors against the laws of the United States. He was tried by military tribunal and hanged on June 7th in the Mint's courtyard. For the South, he became a martyr and an enduring symbol of Butler's harsh rule over New Orleans. On June 7th, 1939, with tensions in Europe threatening to break into a war at any moment, King George VI of the United Kingdom became the first reigning British monarch to visit the New World when he embarked on a cross-Canada tour. President Roosevelt chose that moment to strengthen UK-US ties when he invited the king to visit the United States, the first time that a British monarch would do so. The royals spent 5 days in the United States, crossing the border on June 7th before donning at the White House on June 8th. They visited landmarks, greeted visitors in the 1939 World's Fair in New York City, and were served hot dogs at Hyde Park. 1 year later, the situation had drastically changed. Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg had fallen. Defense in France was collapsing, and in April, Nazi Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. On June 7th, King Haakon VII of Norway left the country to establish a government in exile in London. He would return on the same day, 4 years later. June 7, 1942, marked the end of one of the most pivotal battles of the Pacific theater of World War II, the Battle of Midway. The battle began 3 days earlier, with much of the fighting taking place on June 4th. The Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers in the fighting, 1 heavy cruiser and 2 destroyers. The battle was over on June 7th, when the USS Yorktown, which had been rushed to the battle after sustaining heavy damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea, finally sank. While the Battle of Midway was being fought, another Japanese force was landing on American shores, the first time enemy forces had landed on American soil since 1815. On June 7th, Japanese forces landed on the Aleutian island of Attu, a day after landing on Kiska. 1,140 Japanese troops faced essentially no resistance, capturing the 45 native Aleuts and 2 white Americans, amateur radio operator Charles Foster Jones and his wife, Etta. Jones was killed shortly after the landing when he refused to repair a radio. The others would all eventually be sent to Japan as prisoners, where 16 of the Aleuts died. American forces would retake the island almost a year later. In 1944, June 7th was the day after the landings at Normandy. At the Ardennes Abbey near Caen, members of the 12th SS Panzer Division executed 11 Canadian POWs, among the first killings of the Normandy massacres, when 156 Canadian and 2 British POWs were murdered after surrendering. Colonel Kurt Mayer was sentenced to death for the massacres, but his sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison, and he was released in 1954. The date also marks the anniversary of multiple important protests or acts of civil disobedience. On June 7, 1893, Mohandas Gandhi was ejected from a train in South Africa because he refused to move to a third-class compartment when he had a ticket for the first-class, whites-only compartment. After training as a lawyer in England, Gandhi had gone to South Africa for a job, but the prejudice in South Africa was unlike any he had experienced before. I was afraid for my very life, Gandhi later recalled. What was my duty, I asked myself. Should I go back to India, or should I go forward with God as my helper and face whatever was in store for me? I decided to stay and suffer. My active nonviolence began from that date. Only a year earlier, and across the world in the United States, Homer Plessy, a fair-skinned mixed-race man, bought a first-class ticket and boarded a whites-only railway car. The event was staged by a civil rights group, which had hired a private detective to arrest Plessy. This case would eventually reach the Supreme Court, where in a 7-1 decision, the court decided that separate but equal laws of Jim Crow did not violate the 14th Amendment, thus clearing the way for segregation. The court didn't begin to reverse the concept until 1954, when it decided Brown versus Board of Education. In sports history, on June 7, 1941, the horse Whirlaway became the 5th horse to win the Triple Crown when he won the Belmont Stakes race. The National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame calls Whirlaway talented and quirky. He was notoriously unpredictable and had a habit of bearing out of the track as if headed for the rail. His trainer, Ben Jones, once called him the dumbest horse I've ever trained. And despite his odd behavior, he won the 1941 Kentucky Derby by 8 lengths, with a record time that stood for more than 2 decades. In 1975, the world's first Cricket World Cup began on June 7th, when the first of 4 matches were played in England. Over the course of 2 weeks, the West Indies cricket team became the first Cricket World Cup champions. A historic NBA Finals game was played in 1998 when the Chicago Bulls, led by Hall of Famers Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Tony Kukoc, and Dennis Rodman, trounced the Utah Jazz in Game 3 of the series, 96-54. It was a new record for the fewest points scored in a finals game, as well as the fewest points in a half, with the Jazz scoring only 23 points in the second half. It was also the largest margin of victory for a finals game in NBA history. The day has also had its share of disasters. Among the worst was the 1692 Port Royal earthquake, which killed 2,000 people in a matter of moments, when the busy port and pirate hotspots saw sand liquefy, submerging large parts of the city, the subject of another episode of the History Guy. Much more recently, in 1971, an Allegheny Airlines flight from Washington, D.C. crashed in poor visibility in New Haven, Connecticut. Nearly all the passengers and crew survived the initial crash, but were unable to exit the aircraft, and died of chemical asphyxiation or burns. 15 of the 27 who died in the cabin were found near the exit door, which remained locked. The NTSB investigation recommended several other safety improvements, including better instructions regarding emergency exits and the addition of emergency lighting. Only 3 people survived. June 7th has had its impression on science. Thomas Malthus first published an essay on the principle of population, anonymously on June 7th, 1798, which first outlined the famous Malthusian trap, that human population growth outpaces humans' ability to increase production of food and other resources. His ideas have remained influential today, more than 200 years later. In 1946, the United Nations Security Council formed a commission to bring atomic energy under international control. Made up of scientists and diplomats, members of the commission began advocating for a single European nuclear research laboratory. On June 7, 1950, Isidore Rabia, Nobel Prize-winning scientist, made a crucial speech at the UNESCO General Conference in Florence. One of the commissioners called the speech a definite turning point, which eventually led to the establishment of the European Organization for Nuclear Research, known by the acronym CERN. On June 7, 1965, Gemini 4, and yes, NASA used the pronunciation Gemini, the second crewed Gemini mission, finished a 62-revolution, 98-hour flight which included the first American spacewalk. Astronauts James McDivitt and Ed White manned the craft, and White conducted the spacewalk, in which he was outside the ship for 23 minutes. Of course, June 7th is also an important date in pop culture history. In 1955, the game show $64,000 Question premiered on June 7th, and a year later, Gene Roddenberry resigned from his job as the Los Angeles Police Department's speechwriter to focus on his writing career, a career that would, of course, allow television viewers to boldly go where no one has gone before. On June 7th, 1972, the musical Grease premiered on Broadway, where its eventual 3,388 performance run would set a record at the time. It was apparently the one that you want. On June 7th, 1977, 500 million people watched the Jubilee Day celebration of the Silver Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II. On June 7th, 1968, the Legoland Billund Resort, the first Legoland, opened in Denmark. The musician Prince was born on June 7th in 1958, and it was on his birthday in 1993 that he changed his name to the Love symbol, although he had an artist modify the symbol as the original could not be copyrighted. To enable it to be used in print, Warner Brothers sent out floppy disks with a custom font. The artist, formerly known as Prince, who sold more than 150 million albums in his lifetime, later reverted his name back to Prince. And in 1753, June 7th affected the history of how we keep history. when an act of Parliament created the first national public museum in the world, the British Museum. Supported by a donation by scientist and president of the Royal Society, Dr. Hans Sloane, of his collection of some 71,000 objects of curiosity upon his death. Today, the museum's collection of more than 8 million artifacts stand as testament that there is so much history to be discovered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.